Quartet schließt Daniel Zamarbide. He studied architecture at the University of Geneva and he was part of the founding team of Group 8. He is leading the architectural office bureau. One continuous theme in his projects and research is questioning the conventions of modern architecture. He was teaching in Lausanne and at the University of Art and Design in Geneva. In his introduction lecture, he will, as I said also before, kind of talk about questioning functionality, dogmas in modern architecture, with taking connections to the gender discussions and asking for alternatives.
Hi, good evening. First of all, thank you for you and Martin for inviting me. I'm quite honored to be here on this very interesting symposium and panel. A bit overwhelmed, I must say, a bit nervous as well. So this time I actually, as I guess everyone else, maybe with the exception of Ramo, I decided to write my stuff, so maybe not to say too many nonsense. I do hope that this kind of gathering manages to open up a little bit more the very narrow structure of architecture and then it actually enlarges a little bit this idea of an architect who builds buildings, which is the main, still unfortunately the main activities that we think of in Switzerland. Is very rooted this idea of Baukultur. So thank you for considering the work of the Bureau as potentially being part of something close to queerness. I also want to express my real humility towards the subject because this is quite, my interest on those topics are quite recent. As much as the readings have influenced lately in the past years, my practice right now has allowed me to look at it differently. I don't consider myself as part of any kind of queer community. I want to quickly introduce the presentation. What you have in front of your eyes are just a series of images of our projects, and they emphasize, I hope, not only a certain variety of formats that we practice, approaches and contexts that we have been lucky to participate in, but also a clear acknowledgement of many of the things that are large in our interventions and that are already there, and that we observe with a lot of attention and we give an important value as much as what we do. The we is also important. It was emphasized before, although I seem to be the main speaker of our work. We are a small team that I want to name my partners and collaborators. Karin Pimenta, Galen Zamarbide, and myself are the three partners who compose the work, and the office between Lisbon and Geneva. But right now we also work with Jörg Heidinger, Mathieu de Mozzi, Lois Weber, Chiara Pezzetta, and Chris Ferry. Also, as Jörg mentioned it, I've been in contact with two main institutions, let's say, for the past 10 years. The first one being the HEAD in Geneva, which is the Art and Design School, and the second one being the FEL, where I co-direct the first year course as a guest professor under the name of Alice. So I will not talk so much about images. They can run on their own. I think they have a narrative of their own. So I will share with you some thoughts that might seem maybe a bit banal, but that are important at least to my practice in a very wide sense. As a starting point, I would like to question the title itself of this gathering, which is Undoing Architecture, because I think it does point out some of the identity issues that we are discussing and will be potentially discussing later. So if there is an architecture to be undone, then we would have to agree on what architecture that is, what type of architecture we're talking about, and what is it that defines it, and what is the framework within which it inscribes itself. There would be, I guess, as the title suggests, an official architecture that corresponds to some expected criteria and that needs deconstructing. This is a word that came already a few times, so I'm using deconstructed or constructed instead of doing or undoing. So is it really architecture the problem or the issue? Or isn't it a certain colonization of the term and the idea by a rather narrow view of its practice? I guess that maybe within the group of people here tonight, the answer is clear, but it is still interesting to situate what I take for granted as being the architecture with the big A, as some say, that the title is referring to. I can imagine that that architecture referred to is the one that started what we call modernism. It commenced, as we know, sorry to be so blunt on this, but between the two world wars, and has occupied, I believe, the main of what architecture has proposed since then and even before that. So architecture in this conception, the art is actually the art of building buildings or building cities by man. And sometimes it is considered also the voids that are between those buildings. The official history of architecture confirms this quite extensively. The full history of modernism and probably everything from the Renaissance onwards, at least in Occident, is made out of a series of figures, erected buildings and male architects. Within this context or this understanding of architecture, there is certainly much to be undone. But I would argue that this is just a small piece of what architecture is or can be. We have not yet, or not completely yet, done what I would call our Howard Zinn homework, where, as you know, he proposed in 1980 a people's history of the United States, a completely different, if not reverse view of an American history that presents its evolution or journey through some of its minorities or margins. It is a history, not the history, suggesting that there could be many others to come. We architects have quite an important job to do on this, because despite the popularity of Colomina's writing, or despite the very interesting attempts of Aaron Betsky, who's very much, I guess, at the heart of this symposium, despite those well-known authors, the presence of what I would call otherness as the opposite of mainstream architecture remains quite marginal. Betsky himself, and this is not a critique because it's still one of the most interesting or inspiring characters for the topic we're dealing with tonight, has written very few monographies on architects that are other than male. So just to follow up on Zinn's history, where is or would be our history of minorities? Well, it does not really exist, but maybe it does in a different form, and not in the typical form of male culture. Male culture, and this is very banal, seems to be in the need of erections, or as Betsky puts it, in projections, as opposed to protections, which would determine female culture, one that protects and includes rather than projects and excludes. And it is very interesting in architectural history that is actually founded on a mythical icon, and I can get the status of myth, which is the primitive hut, an erected construction. The other history could well start in the caves. This is also a suggestion by Betsky, but many others as well. An already existing environment that needed settling on, or in French we say ménagement, which is a very beautiful word, taking care of, arrange, cultivate, put in order, things like that. If this is the start of another history, then we encounter what is called interior design at the center of our profession, or even decoration, if we consider the symbolic parietal art as an essential feature of the Homo species existence. The last aspect of this new historical departure is cohabitation with what Donna Haraway names companion species, as we were not the only ones occupying the hollow space of the caves. Then maybe pigmentation, textile making and protection, cultivating and growing plants, arranging spaces, maintaining them, building supports for being together, like fire, etc. Maybe all those things are also part of this other thing that we call architecture. Architecture does not need to be undone. What does need to be undone is the invasion, the colonization of the term and the field. The other aspect that I am struggling with myself is the idea of globalized views. Synthetic overviews of any kind of topic as opposed to stories, small stories that connect with other stories, creating thus fields of intertwined cultural paths and journeys. I'm very Haraway again. As I was proposing before, male culture is based in erecting, and theory and thinking does not escape to that. It is very hard for an Occidental white male like I am to get rid of a great cultural weight that pushes me inevitably towards these male generalizations. Much of the reading that I have done takes me there and makes it very difficult to consider the world other than globally as a projection, and to put it in Haraway's beautiful words, I missed my text here. Consider the world other than globally. But I am trying and believing very strongly that the present and future, or once again to put it in Haraway's beautiful words, the thick present, resides in smaller and interconnected storylines or stream figures. This goes for architecture as well. The normative practice and the practices and the media that not only accompany them but also contribute to their existence and implementation in society are global or very globally communicated. The others, they stay or are kept marginal. I do not need to name the figures that have constructed this normative culture, stating at times enormous and quite alarming statements like the city is all we have, as did Remco has in his famous Whatever Happened to Urbanism, and other times reminding us how creative is to build the newest and tallest skyscraper of the world. Our practice that we call the Bureau, it is today not too old. Its activity commenced in 2011, 2012, with a slightly different configuration than what it is today, but presented already this, what I consider a blurry identity, one that tries to hide under its generic name a certain number of different practices. We call ourselves architects because that's what we are, but we also believe that architecture allows for a great variety of doings. I believe that the core of the Bureau lies in an interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary approach with a strong tendency towards transdisciplinarity, where our interventions navigate within and among different fields with a certain notion of coherence. Even though the fields of our disciplines, I don't like the word disciplines so much, but let's say, even though the fields are sort of neighbors, landscape architecture, art, design, architecture, education, pedagogy, writing, they all have different cultural histories and theories that surround them and constitute them. Within those fields, I would like to think that we are already swimming in transdisciplinary waters. We have indeed intervened in a certain number of public spaces that could be considered heterotopian. I would not dare to include them yet or work inside a queer spatial strategies, but I do feel from a little knowledge of the subject that some similarities can be found. The Bureau has built itself working along many storylines, creating connection points and installing our works or contributions in larger networks. There has never been a question of hierarchy in whatever we do, treating the same way, with the same intensity, small contributions with larger ones. This, again, might seem very banal to be said, but it's still something that, at least in my own personal ambition as a member of the Bureau. Approaching soon my fifth decade of life, I am not quite sure now of what I don't want to be part of, and building erections is one of them. The last element I would like to propose as an operational context of exploration is what I'm now calling, this is temporary because it's not yet very clear for me, what I call fields of trans. The name is not definite, but it contains these two ideas that I cherish more and more. It is actually a sort of digression of, or displaced translation of transdisciplinarity, but I take it as an operational place where architecture can be activated. Fields coming from the French milieu, I guess this now has a long tradition in theory, and trans as per transgender, translation, transdisciplinary, transition, a prefix that crosses and moves boundaries across and around continuously. And in the trans, I would also like to include any living being as a possibility to participate to our architectural field trips in our practice as much as in the pedagogy context that I am in. I would like now to conclude with one of the most beautiful moments of translation that I have experienced in the last decade, and that has, in my opinion, enormous implications to our practice and the philosophies of plural, of inhabitation. It is, once again, coming back to Donna Haraway, that is it's a translation of Vincent Després, Florence Kemets, Julien Piron, in a conversation with Donna Haraway, and they propose the following, and this is in French. Nous proposons de traduire staying with par habiter, qui reprend l'idée du séjour. To stay égale séjourner, demeurer, loger, tout en permettant une entente en voie moyenne, habiter autant qu'être habité par, y être et en être. Thank you very much.